think, Optimize sort of fits in with that kind of student-centered pattern,
Yeah, let's talk about that. So that's one of the themes that I want to ask you about, because in 2016 you did a lecture in East Quad for I can't remember the name of the lecture, but it's an annual lecture that's focused on undergraduate education, or at least yours was. And you gave this whole narrative that, at the time I felt really good about, because it turned out, there was this punchline of what does the future of education look like? It looks a lot like Optimize. I was like, yes, it does. But you actually, what I've found more interesting since then, is the actual story that you told about. There have been these different waves of innovation in higher education, and it feels like we're in one right now. And I think, I've definitely gotten that sense from other leaders as well, that there's opportunities for new things to be happening that wouldn't have happened before. So something like Optimize, which was started by students as a student organization, then developed into an official university program to be placed at this, sort of like milestone site for the College of LSA, is something that would not have happened 20 years ago. And getting the context, though, of what kinds of things came before this that did allow this to happen, that allowed this to be the wave that, the way you put it is, the last wave was towards student-centered initiative, and now it's moving towards student-led initiatives in higher ed. But you sort of talk through all the way back to the 60s of the ways that sort of innovation has happened in higher ed. I wonder if you could sort of track back through some of that.
Yeah, it's a really interesting pattern, right, of kind of waves and ebbs and flows. And I think it's really interesting that we use so many water metaphors for these sorts of things. There's a kind of oceanic feel to it. And I think that expresses something about how change happens in institutions like those that are, characteristic of higher ed. So, what's really interesting is that, there are waves that really start in the 1960s when what it means to be a college student, or what colleges are, what universities are being fundamentally rethought in the United States, really driven by this huge generation, the baby boomers.
Mm-hmm.
So they go to college in larger numbers, percentage-wise, than Americans had before. There are a lot of them on campuses, and, they decide that they have opinions about what their education should look like and can look like. And one of the big things that they do is to get rid of the idea that universities serve in loco parentis, so in the stead of parents. And that's a really different kind of model, right? When going to college was sort of an extension of the authority of your parents. Which tends to be unquestioned, really definitive, very paternal. And so the baby boomers change all of that and really introduce the idea that students might have rights, that they might have interests of their own over and against the faculty and the institution, that they have a right to be heard. Not for nothing, right, that Berkeley have the free speech movement, which was really about students wanting to have more say about what happened on their campuses, what a campus was used for. So was there military research? Were there recruiters on campus for the armed forces? I mean, those kinds of questions. So all of that stuff starts on campuses that become really contested spaces for that generation. So the more responsive parts of institutions experience a wave where students are, so they become less children and more young adults, which is really important. And then some institutions themselves are trying to kind of reshape themselves around this new, this new energy that students are bringing to campuses. So you get a wave of things founded that are universities without walls, residential colleges that are tucked inside of, R1, Research One institutions like Michigan. So the University of Michigan, in that period, sees the founding of the residential college here. At Michigan State, it's James Madison College is founded around the same time. NYU founds the Gallatin School of Individualized Study. And all of these things share kind of more openness towards student interest and student desire. And they want to be less rigid institutionally. Majors are really less traditionally organized, more interdisciplinary. It's really for a lot of institutions that the rise of this kind of one wave that's just going to be interdisciplinarity in general. I have to say, from my own experiences in college, I benefited from that wave. By the time I was ready to go to college, these things had been much more established. So I'm a graduate of James Madison College at Michigan State, where I was able to major in justice, morality, and constitutional democracy. Right? I mean, I was just all in for that. I mean, it was a really great experience in which you had smaller classes, interdisciplinary majors, much closer relationships to the faculty. So they had that when I went to college, you still had that wave that was developing. So that was one big one. The next one really comes around the mid to late 1980s. And that's rise of programs like Europe, the Undergraduate Research Opportunities Program. Learning communities are founded at that time. Lots of things are going on around the desire to be more student-centered, student-focused, which means that you're putting students literally at the center of things that you're building and developing to be able to allow them to grow and flourish.
So going back to the first wave initially, is there some irony that a big reason, as far as I understand it, why there were so many more college students, so many more people going to college by the time we got to the 60s was because of post-World War II legislation that made it possible for returning soldiers, but also other people, to attend universities, maybe for the first time, first generation, a huge wave of first generation students. So sort of this, this military-based sort of, story that then results in a generation that's questioning, military involvement in universities, and there's all this sort of, protest on campus around. Obviously, the Vietnam War became a huge, huge focal point. And I think when you think about a place like Ann Arbor in the '60s, it's heavily centered around the Vietnam protests.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think, that whole wave, that whole wave of innovation was really about questioning authority in ways that just hadn't been done before. And that felt really new. I mean, my heart goes out to that generation of university administrators. I'm an administrator myself. I know what it's like to kind of sit in those seats, and kind of confront students who all of a sudden start to speak a different language. And I think for that generation, I mean, this was just sea change, right? Yeah, another water metaphor. I mean, it must have been just absolutely startling. And then they were forced to kind of question everything that they had been raised to think about, that they had been trained for. So their whole sense of how to run a university, right, in local parentis, completely got challenged, by these waves of students. And, some of the people who returned home and went to college on the GI Bill, they had their own questions about authority and things that they had experienced in military service, and so
sure,
campuses became a really rich brew, right, of young people and slightly older people with really different kinds of opinions. It had also been a generation raised in the great post-war economic boom. They had more disposable income. They had grown up in, really different kinds of environments than their parents would have. They kind of grew up in a non-scarcity environment in a lot of ways. And for them, they bring a whole different set of expectations to college campuses. I mean, so it's a great moment of democratization of college campuses and universities.
And this clip came from a longer episode of the Why Not Me podcast. Find it on Spotify, YouTube, Apple Music, or wherever you listen to your podcasts.